Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the fantastically talented Kathryn Hahn to talk all about WandaVision. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you about is that whenever you're talking about the way in which you develop characters, you always describe that the most important foundation is having such a core sense of self for the character. And with a character like Agatha, what was that foundational starting point for you that you then built all of the layers of her upon?
That's a really good question. For me, because she has such a rich and deep history in the comics, I had no idea. I had never heard of her before doing this show. So all I had really going into this was just what the amazing Jack Schaefer had and her team of writers had written. So for me, it was this sense of I had to go back to her beginning, which was the betrayal by her of her to her coven and by her coven. So is it coven or coven? I never remember, but which I should. But for me, that's where it started. That she was like Wanda, born with this gift that she was told from the beginning that she was bad, and so that was kind of her defining characteristic.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting emotional space to put a character into by saying from so far back, there's nothing that you can do to redeem yourself. This is who you are. And then obviously it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. And I was interested in the way that you use that to build a lot of the emotional fabric behind a lot of her actions. You know, that's why she's so fascinated with Wanda. That's why she also has resentment. That's also why she feels a connection at the same time. And so how did that one foundational element of her build so many emotional strands for you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you're really nailing it. Like, absolutely. We had always talked about this relationship as being kind of the Amadeus Salieri relationship, that Agatha is kind of the Salieri in the relationship, like an older, incredibly passionate, very hungry, very learned, in this case, witch that just doesn't have the natural talent that this young witch possesses and doesn't just wants it with all of her being. And so in that relationship, there can be so many facets. There can be mentor, friend, mother, enemy. There can be jealousy. There can be awe. There can be respect. There can be hatred. There can be all of those colors can happen within that dynamic. And to your point about having been defined as bad as a young person, it's interesting. We as women, are told to be a good girl from the time, we're itty bitty. At least my generation was, for sure. And so it's interesting to get into a mindset of being, what if I had been told that I was bad from the second I was from, one of my earliest memories? And what does that do to your internal compass? And how do you, what does that do? What does that do to you in your relationships and your sense of intimacy? I mean, she's been alone the centuries that she's been floating around looking, without a coven. And so it's an interesting way to look at this relationship with this young, gorgeous, incredibly, innately talented witch that she meets. And there's a lot of feelings that go along with it, of course.
Yeah. And then once you're in the setting of those sitcom episodes, it's really interesting because we never see Agatha outside of the context of Wanda. We never see her home. She comes over, she complains about her husband, she complains about her in-laws. And for you, how did you want to construct the world outside of Wanda's home? Did you feel like she went home and Ralph is really there? Or did you feel like she went home and that's where kind of all of her darkness unearths for the end of the day because she no longer has to put a face on in front of other people anymore?
God, these are so great. These questions are amazing. I've never been asked these before. I think I'd always imagined it in that basement that we finally see in episode 7, that had always been kind of where she set up shop with her runes on the wall, that was her safe space, and that Ralph, for sure, I mean, she's kidnapped that young man. Had nothing to do with him. He was collateral damage.
It also must be such a fascinating exercise in backstory with a character like this as well, that literally stems back hundreds of years. And so you mentioned, obviously, before you had a huge Bible and you had all the information coming from the comics, but what were the spaces in between that were really important for you to try and build out and concoct for her?
Well, as an actor, you only really, I had this wealth of information that our producer, Mary Lavanos, who is a Marvel producer, and she's incredible. And she had given me, yes, a binder of every time Agatha Harkness was mentioned in a comic from the 60s. And they're incredible images, and she looks very different than the Agatha that we see in WandaVision. But we definitely wanted to keep parts of her. If you ever see those images, like, she still has the brooch, she has a high neck. There's something that harkens to an earlier, no pun intended, an earlier time.
Yeah.
Something rigid.
Yeah.
And she has a familiar which in the comics was a cat named Ebony. In our show, it's a rabbit named Scratchy, which could be a reference to Nicholas Scratch, and which is a reference to Nicholas Scratch, let's get honest. But nothing is by accident in this world, I found out. But in this, so we knew all that about her. I knew all about that, so much about her from the comics. But in this iteration of her, as an actor, you just work with the writing in front of you. And so I did have to do a lot of, like you do in any work, in any job, a lot of filling in the dots. And I just imagined there had been many, many years, almost like a vampire, of just laying dormant. Witches have a beautiful history of being close, very, very close, and harnessing the power of the natural world. And so I just really imagined her spending a lot of time underneath a tree somewhere in Eastern Europe.
One of the things I find so fascinating about how well it was executed in the series is that anytime you start any television project or any film, there's always that journey of finding what is the voice and what is the tone of this. And with this show, you have to do that all over again. Every single episode has a completely new and unique voice, and yet there's a linearity between it all as well, in which connects it. And so how were you finding the different spaces where you could take this character and take your performance and take the overall tone of scenes and yet still have it all connect together with that thread across the entire series?
Well, I think that it was knowing, we had the luxury of knowing exactly where it was going. And so we all had the luxury of knowing what was the underneath. And so then it didn't feel like we were starting from scratch every episode. It felt like we had that core, and then we were able to just immerse ourselves in this new vocabulary on top of it. So the vocabulary was the clothing, the style, the kind of comedy, the hair, the amazing wigs, the body language, where the register of the voice was. So all of that stuff was kind of given to us as we kind of walked through it, but we never lost sight of the underneath. And I think that's why I'm hoping and assuming that's why one was able to feel like the tension underneath all of the episodes. It felt similar because that was always operating.
Yeah. And then I also wanted to talk about your work with Courtney Young, who is a dialect coach working with you on the series, because you mentioned the register of the tone there, and that really shifts throughout the entire series. It starts at a much higher register, and then by the time we get to the final episode, you're really going into like the depths and the baritone of your voice once everything is unleashed, but it's also time period specific. But even within that, there's a difference in the intonation and the pacing and the delivery of every single word in all of them stylistically. And so how were you working with Courtney to really finesse and figure out the specific nuances of each of those sounds?
She gave me all of us, so much raw material to work with so we weren't just watching sitcoms, which also was very helpful just stylistically in terms of the kind of comedy and the rhythm and the timing and the technique. But we were able to hear raw footage of just women talking, commercials from the eras, interviews with people. And it was very interesting. I mean, me as a white woman in the United States, a straight white woman in the US, to hear just from this perspective, to hear how our voices changed from this kind of sing-songy end in a question, kind of unthreatening, kind of, you could just blow her off a page into the ether, like no back, like kind of no real center. And at the same time, there really is no breath. Like you have a corset on, you're, trying to keep it together while you're running a house, all of this nonsense, deferential to the man of the house, yada, yada. And then to find that, and at the same time, the comedy is so earnest and so non-cynical. And then to see it start to unravel as the decades go by is just fascinating. Was really interesting to see the cynicism start to come in, sarcasm start to come in, looseness in comedy, and to hear women's voices drop into their centers was so it's just like, it's so crazy just to actually see it happen. And especially in that form of a sitcom, which is so, the sitcom is just aspirational. To see diversity happen, like, thank God, like all of a sudden, like all of it, to see groups represented all of a sudden that hadn't been, so it was really an interesting history lesson, is the American sitcom, for sure.
And there's such a different physicality in all of those performances as well. And, even when you're mentioning having a corset, obviously there's a different poise and structure to the way that people used to hold themselves. There's much more casualness in the way that we all move now. And how did you want to structure out and find the different movements of Agatha as a character?
The wardrobe helped immensely. I mean, it was all just in the wardrobe. Like those in the 50s, it was just that bullet bra, the corset, the nylons, the heels, like the amount of underclothes that went into just walking next door to your neighbor's house or putting on a dinner was so absurd. Even for the men, just like lounging at home, there's no sweatpants, there's no leisure wear, didn't start for a while. Like what we know about sweatpants wise, which is like you wouldn't know it today, but it is my usual go-to. But it was, so that was really fascinating. And that informed posture, of course, it informed movement, and it informs character, it informs, the wigs informed so much too. I thought the wigs were just phenomenal. And that also really helped just drop you into each decade. And also the art department. I mean, it was like you would walk onto the set and it was the same set, but it was a complete different, you were in you couldn't help but just be open to the new time that you were in. They did a lot of the work for us. I mean, they made it so easy to just transform.
And as the comedic sensibility shifts in and you're playing homage to these different styles of sitcom, at the same time, it's kind of playing around with the format a little bit, winking a little bit at it, but it never crosses the line at any point into being satirical and making fun of the format. It's really a love letter to it and always comes back to that emotional grounding, the relationships, the emotions of everything. And in particular, when you were filming the first episode, did having a live audience for that really help in finding that? Because at the same time, you also need those elements in order to connect with a live audience and bring them into it.
It was so interesting because I remember when we read it and I thought it was so brilliant, beautifully, painstakingly written to echo exactly what the comedy of that time would feel like. And what the experience of watching one of those old episodes of television feel like to hit me as, in this century. And when I heard that we were shooting it in front of a live audience, I have to admit, I did have a fear of like, what if they don't laugh? Like this is a different, we're so jaded. We're so quick to swipe left. Like those jokes take their time. Like, that is a situational comedy, a sitcom. Like you set something up and then it takes 20 whatever minutes to resolve it. Like, are people going to have the patience to sit with it? These were all things I was wondering as we were rehearsing this. And that shoot day was so magical because that sweet audience really went on a ride. And because the jokes, I mean, again, Jack Schaefer is so amazing, but the jokes were so good and specific, but had enough arch to today that didn't feel like you were making fun of anything, but just were enough to hook you. And you always knew something was afoot. And you needed that immediacy to get that reaction. Like I'm so forever grateful to Matt Shackman for making sure that happened. I just don't think it would feel as heightened if we had tried to do that, pre-tape it,
And once we get to the last couple of episodes and everything becomes much more heightened and there's more action within it, you've mentioned that was actually one of the huge draws, that you were so excited to step into that world. And in particular, when you've done previous projects, you've always wanted to put yourself forward and to do your own stunt work. But obviously this was an amalgamation. But at the same time, you're still doing a lot of wire work. You are doing stunt work. And so how did you find that doing stunt work on a whole bunch of independent projects on other television shows actually really helped you to finesse what you needed to pull together for your performance in that scope on this?
Well, I've always been enamored with and just in awe of the stunt community. I just love stunts. It just feels like when I wanted to grow up and join the circus and be a trapeze artist, like that's always like, it feels like the closest that I am to that is when I get to hang out with the stunts. The woman that did my stunts, Whitney Coleman, is just like, and so yeah, she was, I got to do though a lot of the wires, Lizzie and I both did, which just feels like it's the greatest for, a mom of two to be able to say that that's her job is so crazy. And Jennifer White, I have to shout out, she was our movement choreographer, and the bulk of my stunt work, I would say, would have been in figuring out Agatha's magic vocabulary with her hands. And we wanted to really make sure it was different than the Scarlet Witches, how she took power, all of her spells. We were interested in cauldron iconography. We were interested in all this kind of, so that was really fun. She was living in the UK though, Jennifer, so we had to do all of that over FaceTime over the course. But it took a lot of work to find that for someone that's not a dancer or that this is impossible for, but that was actually really fun and imperative to deepening Agatha, for sure.
But it's also such a challenge to have something that is essentially a really minute motion that channels so much energy and so much power within a scene. Mm-hmm. And when you watch that scene with you and Lizzie in the sky, the camera is actually really close on both of you a lot of the time. There's a lot of close-ups of just your face or just kind of like a medium shot as well. And so how did that really help you both to connect so much of the intimacy of that scene and all of the conversations that they're having with each other that they're not necessarily saying out loud, but is there in that exchange?
Well, it's because we were able to look at each other's eyeballs. We were still, even though we were in wires, or if one of us was on a wire, the other person would be on a ladder. Mm-hmm. We would just have to make sure that we were there for each other in those ways, because you're right. It would fall if it would fall apart if it wasn't happening that way, and especially at the end there. And yeah, that was imperative that happened, and that the motion, that these are not. I had never done anything like this before, where I was playing someone that has powers that are not human or not necessarily. I'd never played this sort of thing before, so it was interesting to try to connect. This had to be very connected to who I was, almost like the roots of a tree. That kept being the image, like, again, Agatha underneath the tree somewhere in Eastern Europe. Like, that kept being like an image for me that I kept having to grab onto so it wouldn't feel unconnected to what we were doing. And most of my work in the finale, the last episode, we had to loop or dub over because I had a fan the size of a frickin' SUV in my face, just blasting that awesome hair backwards. But I remember getting the call being like, so, and I was like, I knew it as it was happening. I was like, they're going to have to loop all of this. So there was a very weird day in my garage where I'm sure my neighbors thought I was getting murdered because I was just in there screaming for about 2 hours while I was looping the finale.
It also sounds like in working with Elizabeth Olsen that as a scene partner, she's such an active listener in paying attention to everything that you're giving her and then responding with more. And so what are the spaces in your performance that you feel like you were really able to elevate what you were doing because of what she was giving you in that way?
Oh, at every moment. I'm only, no one is as good as their scene partner. I mean, like, I owe it all to, she's incredible. And we found such a deep gray area right off the bat, because we kind of fell in love so early on, just Lizzie and I just adore her as a human. It really charged the relationship. Like, it didn't feel black and white at all. It felt immediately very gray, just because we just adore each other so much. And so I think that really did help with the complexity of their relationship, and made little turns happen that were unexpected, and made little things happen that we could never have anticipated. And I just think she's so phenomenal. And so Lizzie, having gone down this road for a decade now in the Marvel year, I think, maybe that's not right, but I think it's been a long time that she's been in the Marvel world. She was a great guide to me through it. So that also was a really great, complicating and delicious element to throw in, that I was definitely looking to her for guidance on how to stay grounded within all the Michigas, and to how to stay connected and stay ask all the right questions, and what to sweat and what not to sweat, and like not to feel embarrassed about scale, and not you have these huge emotional moments and you're just like literally by yourself in front of a green screen, and there's like, you feel like you're falling into the abyss because you're like, oh my goodness, but you just have this amazing scene partner that you're looking at. And it's like, so she's incredible.
What is that journey in finding the balance? Because you're giving such a large performance, and in so many different ways, you're finding how you can push to the extremity of what that moment is, what that scene is, what that tone is. And then at the same time, you're also delivering so much nuanced information and delivering so many details behind all of that. So how do you find that flow and that balance going between those two spaces within singular moments and lines of delivery?
Well, I think in this case, I was very lucky to have Matt Shakman as the director. He comes from the theater, and he's worked in all sorts of genres, sitcoms and Game of Thrones. Like he's done it all. And so I was able to really I trusted him, and I trusted if it was too big, and I trusted if it was too small. And so we played a lot, especially at the beginning of, we always kind of knew that we were in the sweet spot with the sitcoms, I think with the decades, because I was able to kind of play, like Agatha was playing an actor. She was like kind of playing and getting information at the same time. But when we got to the Agatha, I really did have to trust him a lot scale wise. And it took us a second, and we really, I am forever grateful. I really, really, really trust his eye. And I was so grateful he was at the helm.
I also love how you describe that he really created that sense of it being like a theater company for everybody on set, and that there was that intimacy amongst the cast and the crew, no matter how big the scope of the project. And so did you find that no matter whether it's a project like this or something like Afternoon Delight, where it was so intimate that you were literally using your own vehicle in the movie to drive people around,
crazy,
that there is that connectivity, and it's irregardless of the scope of a project.
Absolutely. It's absolutely. Like you feel that if it's gelled, if like the thing is gelled, it's the same feeling. Like I had the same feeling walking onto the set of this that I did with Afternoon Delight, like for sure, because the thing felt that there was an intention set to make something. Like, when the intention is kind of like when everyone's like in their own schools or whatever, or when everyone is there to build the thing. And this felt very intentional in the same way. And I'm not just talking the actors, I'm saying like everybody, crew and everybody, like the whole thing.
On a separate note, there's something that you've always talked about in terms of your career overall, and you've said plenty of times that in your 20s you felt like career-wise it was very much one foot in front of the other, just kind of like, and it wasn't always necessarily taking a job that was going to fulfill you creatively in the same way that you've been able to shape your career now, and that also sometimes it would feel a little bit like showing up and trying to be someone else's perspective of who you should be as an actor on screen. And so what was that shift for you, and how you were able to find the malleability to really shift it from being someone else's perspective as an actor to being your perspective of who you wanted to be as a performer?
These are such good questions. I would say becoming a mom, in my case, it's different for everybody. I feel I was going to say I wish it had happened earlier, but it couldn't have happened earlier. It happened exactly at the time it was supposed to. And I'm also totally grateful for those gigs and those experiences I had before. But there is something about I just had to get the focus, I guess, off of my own self, like doubt, my own my own perception of what I thought Hollywood was. Like, I think I had, I was always wanted to do theater. It was like I had my theater self, and then this kind of money making, or that this is where I would like have a money making career, like, this is how I never thought I would make a living, but I thought like, oh, this is where I would get paid for it. But it never would feel the same way creatively as when I'm doing theater. And it wasn't until I was older that it really felt like that I could find that same connectivity between the two. So I'm still forever grateful. And I also like that I just am able to be able to take still be able to be, I don't even say like be able to be seen for different genres. Like I still just am, I just am an actor. So I love acting. I love any genre. So the theater nerd in me is like, I want to be in summer stock for the rest of my life. Like, I just want to do a drama one day, a big superhero thing one day, a teeny little something one day, an animated thing one day. I mean, the fact that I get to do all of this and not feel like I'm pigeonholed is is delicious.
Yeah. No, and exactly as you said, whenever you watch your work, that's always the huge delight, is it takes audiences to so many different places, and particular with this role, it's so phenomenal watching the way that you draw so many different types of performance into it. And so I just want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to us all about WandaVision.
Oh my God, this was a lovely, lovely interview. Thank you so much for having me, Mara. This was a great, great way to end this day. A Friday.